Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Georgi Kantera. I'm ancient history tutor here, and it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce Sir Donald Russell Memorial Lecture. To say a few words about Donald Russell first, Donald was the longest serving fellow of this college. He been fellow in classics for 72 years, for nearly 70 of which he taught. And to speak of the college side first, he's been the great uniting force of the St. John's Classics community for many, many decades. And it's a testament to how Donald Russell built it up that today we are having all range from people of 1958 matriculation year. I think that's the furthest I can see in the past. My apologies if I missed anyone. To people who matriculated just last week. And we hope after this lecture and in years to come, the continuity of this community would remain strong as Donald would have wished it. It's important for us in college, and it's an important testament of the college's commitment to classics and to Donald's memory to continue classics here not simply as an undergraduate subject, but as an intellectual endeavor. College is about to, thanks to generosity of people Donald taught in the past, to announce some good news about graduate scholarships. We have, at the moment, all sorts of exciting research going in college, and these lectures serve the purpose of keeping alive and advertise to the whole college community the parts of classics which Donald, as a scholar, made particularly his own. And of course it was Donald's great joy in the last year of his life that his current successor, Emma Smith, is a student of Imperial Greek literature herself, and continues the Donald Russell tradition in this college. As many people around here, and I can see many faculty colleagues and many people who worked with Donald, who were taught by Donald, around the room, will know Imperial Greek literature, especially, I think, the arts of prose and rhetoric, but today we're having the extension of that into poetry, was the field in which Donald Russell was a pioneer and a central figure in too many ways to mention in the 20th century. Scholarship and the modern era in the study of Imperial Greek literature at Oxford in so many ways begins with him. And it couldn't be with more pleasure that I introduce today's speaker, Professor Ewen Bowie, who is a giant in this field, and most people around the room would have known Ewen both through his decades of teaching at Oxford as Classics Fellow at Corpus Christi College, and through his contribution to scholarship. I myself remember with great warmth the class on second sophistic you've given me, Ewen, when I was a master's student, and basically all I know about second sophistic still goes back to that class. And Ewen's exceptionally distinguished academic career started in this college as a second Woodhouse Junior Research Fellow in Classics, an extraordinarily distinguished sequence of scholars of which Donald Russell was exceptionally proud. And there isn't really an area in later Greek literature to which he hasn't made a contribution. And for me as a historian, it's always been a pleasure to see Ewen crossing into the historical, not just literary appreciation of that literary era. And today we are going to hear him talk on Hadrian's favorite Greek poet, Mesomedes of Crete. And without further ado, I pass it over to Ewen.
Thank you, Georgi, for these extremely kind words. I was extremely moved to be invited by St. John's to deliver the third Russell Lecture, and I would like to begin by expressing my warm gratitude for that invitation. I owe a huge debt to the great scholar whom this series honours, a debt I'm very grateful for the opportunity to acknowledge. As an undergraduate, I had attended Donald Russell's lectures on Longinus, and it was with Longinus and the study of ancient literary criticism that I associated him when I came to St. John's as a Woodhouse Fellow in 1963, as Georgi has mentioned. As I soon discovered, Donald's interests in imperial Greek literature were already much wider than Longinus, and I learned a great deal from him about Plutarch and about Dio of Prusa, as likewise from his gentle criticism of my own work on Philostratus that I ventured to show him. I also benefited from guidance in the teaching he asked me to do of Greek language and literature. I recall setting one of Churchill's famous war speeches for translation into Greek on the occasion of his death in January 1965 in a room just off the front quad. I was also privileged to discuss with Donald the momentous proposals that he, Robin Nisbet, and Godfrey Bond were hatching for bringing literature into greats that was hitherto confined to philosophy and ancient history, and to join Donald and the St. John's Greats tutors in interviewing candidates for undergraduate award and places, one of whom was the great scholar Stephen Mitchell. All this unobtrusive mentoring was enlivened by observing Donald's wry humour in common room, where he often duelled with the then senior fellow, Edwin Slade, a bachelor who, whenever the opportunity offered, described marriage as committing matrimony. At that time, Donald was himself a bachelor, but when he and Joy committed matrimony, they were constant providers of generous and relaxed hospitality. When I had left St. John's for Corpus, a move in which Donald was, of course, not uninvolved, we continued to see each other in various contexts, and from time to time, Donald organized a small seminar or reading class on one of Plutarch's Moralia, usually held in his room, which I always tried to attend. In 1988, he organized a larger seminar on imperial Greek literature, and it was in the paper I offered to that seminar that I first tangled with Mesomedes. It was in Donald's editing of my paper for the volume that appeared in 1990 that he proposed the convincing conjecture, erotopalaismaton, of erotic wrestling, in the last line of the poem On the Sponge. That is a poem you find in my rather long handout on page 9, and it is the poem number 9 in the standard numeration of these poems. And there, the Vatican Ortobonianus Graecus manuscript gives a non-metrical reading, eroticon omaton. Donald could see that that wouldn't work, and his erotopalaismaton has stood the test of time. fortified by Donald's apparent interest in, or at least tolerance of Mesomedes, despite his own principal field having been Imperial Greek prose, I have chosen as the subject of this lecture the early 2nd century citharode, Mesomedes, whose composition and performance of relatively short songs caught the imagination of his contemporaries, most significantly of the Emperor Hadrian. Some continued to be sung at least until the early 5th century AD, when Synesius mentions singing his hymn to Nemesis, my item 1 on the handout, and Synesius himself uses Mesomedes meters in his own hymns. The hymn to Nemesis was also known in the 6th century, that is hymn number 3. That hymn to Nemesis, a hymn to the sun, to Helios, and 2 short proemia, preludes to hymns, have been transmitted together with musical notation, probably thanks to their continuous use in musical education throughout antiquity and into the Byzantine, late antiquity and into the Byzantine period. To appreciate fully the impact of Mesomedes' songs on the development of Greek sung poetry, poems sung both by choral groups and by individuals, it would be necessary to trace the gradual shift from metrical complexity and to metrical simplicity that had characterized most sung poetry between the 7th century BC and the 2nd century AD. And for such an investigation, there is manifestly no time this afternoon. Instead, I shall leapfrog to the example of a poem composed a century or so before Mesomedes, the Paean of Macedonius or Macedonicus of Amphipolis, my handout 3, a paean written in 20 lines. You can see that this composer opted for various dactylic units, some longer, including dactylic hexameters, some shorter. His song was inscribed in the 1st century AD in Athens, but its orthography suggests that it was composed earlier in the 1st century BC. In either case, it certainly precedes Mesomedes. And as I said, handout 3 gives you that song, the signature, and lines 1 to 4, and also then lines 11 to 13. 11 to 13 I pick out because they're the first to be almost completely legible, and also later lines 19 to 20. And I shall simply read out 19 to 20 to give a flavor of the meter. Sod zois dat de kekropian pollen ein perchamanos e paian. E pios esse makar stugaras da peruki nusus ie paian. And this paean simply exemplifies, in the context of my talk, the shift towards metrical simplicity that I mentioned, that contrasts with songs composed before the 2nd century BC, including some songs like the Paean of Sophocles that were still being performed despite complexity in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. What then about the impact of Mesomedes? By the time of Diophantus of Suetus, my item 5 on the handout, whose metrical prayer to Asclepius to cure gout is preserved on an inscription, fashions have changed. This poem's 20 lines are all apocrypha, and for the very simple pattern of the apocryphon, see handout 6. And this Diophantus is perhaps the same as an Athenian Prytanis of 167 AD. If so, he is composing late in the 2nd century, a generation or so, maybe 2 generations after Mesomedes. The prayers 20 apocrypha are preceded by a line of prose and followed by 4 hexameters which thank Asclepius for duly curing Diophantus. And in the handout I print only the opening prose signature and the 20 apocrypha. And I'll just read a few lines of the Greek, again to give a flavour of the meter. Tadisoi zakaros philios lego, asclepia leto dupai, pos crucion es domina hexamai, ton son macer o pepathemine, thiacephale, podos uch echon, whose toprin is here on eluthon. And so he goes on, apokriton after apokriton. At least one factor that I think influenced Diophantus' choice of meter in this poem was surely the success of the songs of the citharode Mesomedes. And to him, and to the songs attributed to him, I now turn. Mesomedes is said to have been from Crete, a lyrikos, player on the lyre, or poetes nomon citharodikon, a poet of citharodic nomoi, and a freedman of Hadrian, to whom he was very close, in en tois malista philos. You'll see this information, which is most of what we know about Mesomedes, in the Suda entry, which I print as handout number 8. Mesomedes clearly made a splash in the reigns of Hadrian and Pius, even as the latter reduced his stipend, handout 9. He may have been chosen by the city of Corion on Cyprus to compose the hymn to Antinous that was found inscribed in the sanctuary of Apollo Hilatos, certainly between 130 and 138. My item 10. And it may be a paean by Mesomedes that was copied on a papyrus from the Thebaid shortly after AD 156, the so-called Berlin paean, as was suggested by Theodor Reinach in 1926 and endorsed by Annie Baylis in 2003, my item 11. In the city of Lapa, in Mesomedes' native Crete, Lapa just outside Rethymnon to the west, a man called Antiochus gave his son the otherwise unattested name Mesomedes, surely an indication that Antiochus was a fan. Item 12. Almost a century later, Caracalla so admired Mesomedes that he built a cenotaph for him, item 13, and he was still remembered in later antiquity, see item 14. The rareness of the name Mesomedes is worth thinking about. If, as I suggest, the man from Lapa was named after Mesomedes, and unfortunately we don't have a precise date for that inscription, but it is thought to be 2nd century. If the man from Lapa was named after Mesomedes, then the hitherto undocumented name Mesomedes was, I think, invented very probably by Hadrian. We know from the speaker Canulcus in Athenaeus that Hadrian used to call one of his freedmen, a comic actor named Aristomenes, by the very uncomplimentary name Atticoperdix, Attic Partridge, item 15. And I guess, it is only a guess, and Donald would not like this, but it is only a guess, that in a similar jocular way, Hadrian gave his talented citharode the name Mesomedes. Now, unlike the very common name Diomedes and many other attested names ending in Medes, like Eumedes or Lycomedes or Nicomedes, the name Mesomedes has a quantifying term as its first element. So whoever gave the Cretan this apparently invented name seems to be playing either on the name Polymedes, which is epigraphically documented many times, especially in Attica, or the name Megamedes, which is epigraphically attested only once at Teos in the 2nd century, or maybe the 3rd century BC, item 16 on the handout. Like the name Atticoperdix, Attic Partridge, the name Mesomedes seems to involve a possibly humiliating joke. The bearer has only moderate media. But in what sense are media here to be understood? The most common reference of media, above all, in high literature is to intellectual abilities, but the sense genitals is well attested, see item 16. So was the Cretan lyre player teased because he had genitals that were neither large nor small, but simply middling? And how does the name Mesomedes relate to the name Ganymedes, where similar double entendre has been widely suspected? A name Ganymedes, which is hard not to think was given by some in Hadrian's circle behind his back to another close philos of Hadrian, Antinous. If Hadrian did indeed calque the name Mesomedes on Megamedes rather than on Polymedes or something else, another point of interest emerges. Apart from the feminine Megamede, the mythical name of Thespis' wife who bore him 50 daughters, the name Megamedes, a unicum in epigraphy, also appears in literature only twice, as far as I know, in each case in a Greek novel, the name of Anthea's father in Xenophon's Ephesiaca, and also in the fragmentary novel Chione. Not surprisingly then, if Hadrian invented the name Mesomedes on the basis of Megamedes, he turns out to have been reading Greek novels. Not something I'm particularly surprised by, but something certainly interesting. And the naming of Mesomedes, although undatable with precision, joins other evidence pointing to a 1st century date for both Chione and Xenophon's Ephesiaca. Well, I repeat that this is all very speculative, and I'm absolutely sure Donald would be laughing at me at this point. Let me return to the poems of Mesomedes, and before discussing him, offer you an example of how a modern musician has tried to recreate the impression given by performances of the songs that have been transmitted together with musical notation. And you're about to hear Bettina de Guzman performing first the short hymn to Calliope and Apollo. I hand out page 6, number 1b, and then the longer hymn to the sun, Helios. Amon will have a stronger view than I can possibly offer on how likely Mesomedes is to have sounded like that. But I'm certainly very interested in Bettina's reconstructions. And for those of you who are also interested, you will find in the handout a link to a performance she will be giving in St. John's College later in the year, late in November, which I urge you, if you're interested, to attend. I'm sure it will be most rewarding. But I now come down from the higher level of music with meter, which I myself don't understand, to the meters, which is what we have in our texts. And as I said earlier, the favorite meter of the poems ascribed to Mesomedes is the apokryton, either on its own, as in poem 7 and for most of 12, or more often in conjunction with paremiacs, as in 2, 3, 6, 8, 9, and 11. These numbers are all to the poems of Mesomedes that are in the last section of the handout before the bibliography. I've put all that we have ascribed to Mesomedes in the manuscript, from manuscripts in that section, not the epigraphic material or the papyrus material, not because I have time to talk about them, but because I thought it might be useful for those of you who do develop an interest in Mesomedes to be able to take them back and have as bedside reading. They're not too long, after all. Modern discussions, including my own in 1990 in the volume edited by Donald, have generally taken the 13 poems attributed to Mesomedes by several scholars, by Horner, by Heitsch, and most recently by Regenaar in her splendid edition with translation into German and commentary. Most discussions have taken these to be the work of Mesomedes. And Reinach and Baylis, as I mentioned earlier, also attributed to Mesomedes the Berlin Paean. Pullman has abandoned his earlier view that the Kourion inscription, my handout 10, is simply by a follower of Mesomedes, and he now thinks it is by Mesomedes himself. See Pullman 2019. But only 5 of these attributions are relatively secure. These 5 are, in the numeration that I have used, which goes back to Heitsch and then Regenaar, numbers 12 and 13, and numbers 1 to 3. And what I go on to say is summarized in handout 20, so that you can raise questions about it later if you wish. 12 and 13 are both attributed to Mesomedes explicitly by the Greek anthology. 3, the hymn to Nemesis, lines 7 to 8, beneath your unceasing traceless orbit is spun the grey fortune of man, were known as by Mesomedes to a late author whose fragments are found ascribed to John of Lydia, fragment Sporia 6, page 184, Wunsch. And for this reason, in 1729, this poem was attributed to Mesomedes by Buret, and I think quite probably correctly. 2 was attributed to Mesomedes in 1840 by Bellarmine for the reason that it is in the same meter as 3, that is, the mixture of apocrypha and paremiacs, and of 12, of which 3 to 12 are apocrypha. 1, part of which was the first song you heard sung by Bettina, was first attributed to Mesomedes by Burke in 1854. 4 to 11 are in a different situation. They were discovered in the Vatican Library's manuscript of Ottobonianus Graecus 59 by Constantine Horner in 1904. They have no musical accompaniment, unlike 1 to 3, and they were attributed to Mesomedes by Wilamowitz in 1921. And his attribution was then endorsed by Horner himself in 1928, whereas Powell, J.U. Powell, in his 1925 Collectanea Alexandrina, had consigned both poems 4, the hymn to Physis, and 5, the hymn to Isis, to his Lyrica Adespota, numbers 35 to 6, and gave them the heading, perhaps Mesomedes. Mesomedes, no, stronger than perhaps, Mesomedes ut videtur, seemingly Mesomedes, but he stood back from actually saying this is certainly Mesomedes. The verdict of the Grand Homme, Wilamowitz, proved very influential, just as a few years later, Vitelli's pronouncement that a long fragment of Philicus was from a hymn was taken as authoritative by his pupil Norsa when she published it in 1927, and a hymn it has continued to be categorized as ever since for the last 100 years almost. But I think the different transmission history of 1 to 3 from the transmission history of 4 to 11 and 12 to 13 should have counseled some skepticism. Poems 1 to 3 are, as I've mentioned, transmitted with musical notation and indeed in several manuscripts. And given the knowledge of poem 2 shown by the author of the John of Lydia Spurious Fragment 6 and its transmission together with 1 and 3, the case for Mesomedes' authorship of these 3 poems, as for the 2 poems explicitly ascribed to him in the anthology, seems to me strong. The case for 4 to 11 being ascribed to Mesomedes seems to be rather weak. And the phenomena could support several different interpretations. I summarize these in handout 22. Possibility 1, 1 to 3 and 12 to 13 are by Mesomedes, but 4 to 11 are by school of Mesomedes, poets of the 2nd century or later who, like Diophantus of Sphetus, were incited by Mesomedes' success to compose in similar metrical and presumably musical patterns. For parallels to poets composing in the style of a famous and successful poet, we could compare the non-Theognidian poems or fragments in the elegiac collection ascribed to the 6th century BC poet Theognis of Megara, or chronologically much nearer to Mesomedes, the Anacreontea, imitating poetry of the 6th and 5th century BC Anacreon of Teos. A second possibility is that all these poems really are by Mesomedes. A third disturbing possibility is that none of them is by Mesomedes. If we test a working hypothesis that 4 to 11 are not by Mesomedes but by school of Mesomedes, the similarity of meters and of imagery should not pose any problem. Nor, for that matter, do the points very subtly elaborated by Tim Whitmarsh, item on the bibliography in the handout, drawing attention to many details where such addressees as the Adriatic Sea or the sun, or such images as that of stars in a course round the sun, are clearly or apparently calculated to appeal to Hadrian's own personal interests. If Mesomedes had admirers in his lifetime, they would surely be just as likely to choose an addressee such as the Adriatic or to exploit the imagery of a chorus of stars in order that they too might achieve the favor of Hadrian. Furthermore, the transmission of not 1 but 2 poems on the sundial My handout 25 refers to this. It is numbers 7 and 8 in the list of poems ascribed to Mesomedes. The transmission of not one but two poems in the sundial suggests to me rather two poets, perhaps competing in the context of the cultured banquets and symposia for which Hadrian was remembered. Handout 26. For me then, either 7 or 8 might have been composed by Mesomedes, but it is improbable that both of them were. I now take one further, even more speculative step. Again, I begin to feel Donald looking over my shoulder. Might some of songs 4 to 11 be composed by the man to whom Mesomedes was en tois malister philos, amongst his closest friends, that is, the Emperor Hadrian? We have several examples of Hadrian's poetry in both Latin and Greek, which I have discussed elsewhere. Some of his Greek poems are inscriptional, see item 27, the 8-line dedication to Eros ascribed at Thespiae, the epigram on Parthenius' tomb, and the dedication to Zeus Cassius, transmitted in the anthology, and specifically ascribed to Hadrian's anathemata dedications by the Suda. Inscribed too is the Latin epitaph in iambic Nimitus catalectic and Aristophaneans for Hadrian's horse Borysthenes. But others that survive seem to have been composed for performance in a sympotic context. For example, one transmitted in the anthology, which I have as item 28 in the handout, and Hadrian's riposte, well-known riposte, I think, to Florus, quoted by the Augustan history, item 29 in the handout. I don't want to be Florus, to cruise through taverns, to skulk in low dives, to endure fat mosquitoes. Neither of these short, apparently sympotic poems is intended to be sung, but we should recall Cassius Dio's statement that Hadrian, while composing all sorts of poetry, built a temple for Plotina and composed some hymns for Plotina, that is the widow of Trajan, kai humnus tenas es auten poesai. So an explicit testimony to Hadrian composing poetry to be sung. Set alongside the claim that Mesomedes was among Hadrian's closest friends, these claims make Hadrian's composition of songs in the style of Mesomedes a reasonable supposition to my mind. And we may also note that at the end of poem 6, line 16 of poem 6, there is a vow to sacrifice a fawn, which better suits Hadrian, whose favourite sport was notoriously hunting, than his court musician, who had other things to do than hunt. One other datum may offer support. Item 31 on the handout, an Athenian inscription of AD 163 lists that year's ephebes, cosmetae, wardens, and teachers. And then it gives the long list of the ephebes themselves, one of a whole series of ephebic inscriptions that has recently been made more accessible by Christolides, putting translations in Attic inscriptions online. In this inscription, column 1, lines 29 to 30, registers one Pythius as didaskalos ephebon, ton asmaton theu Adrianou, the ephebes teacher of the songs of divine Hadrian. These asmata songs have been taken to be songs in honor of Hadrian, for example, by Lucia d'Amore, un maestro degli efebi destinati al canto nelle cerimonie in onore di Adriano Divinizzato, see item 31, and also more recently by Francesca Camea in 2022. And this interpretation has some support from the hymning of Hadrian by Ephebes in the theatre at Ephesus when he visited that city in 123-4 or in 129, which I document as handout 32. But I suggest that the correct term for songs in honour of Hadrian would be hymnoi, not asmata, hymns, not simply songs. And moreover, the genitive Theo Adrianou of the divine Hadrian with the term asmaton songs is more probably subjective than objective, whereas hymnoi, hymns, with the genitive of the entity that is hymned, is well attested, since to have the status of a hymn, a song requires an entity who is praised and or addressed. The unmarked term asma, which can be used equally of high hymnic and low secular songs, is not attested with the genitive denoting the song's subject. Of the many examples of uses of asma that make this unmarked status clear, that I have put down in item 34, only really for the connoisseur of uses of the term asma. I note especially, handout 33, a line or two in Philostratus' Nero, that is the Nero that comes down in the Lucianic corpus, which is now, I think, mostly taken to be by Philostratus. Pro elthon de tes skenes, hymnon men amphitrites de kai Poseidonos esse, kai asma omega melicerte de kai Leucothea. Coming out of the stage building, he sang a hymn in honor of Amphitrite and Poseidon, and a quite short song, asma, to Melicertes and Leucothea. Melicertes and Leucothea. In the dative, it wouldn't have worked in the genitive. I suggest that what the Athenian ephebes in the 160s were being taught by their tutors were not songs in honor of Hadrian at all. They were songs composed by Hadrian, songs that I guess were very probably in the manner of Mesomedes. Where does this take us then? The asmata, songs of Mesomedes, marked a sea change in Greek song poetry. Whether what survives is all by Mesomedes, or only some surviving poems are his and others are by followers of Mesomedes, he seems to have established a fashion in the early decades of the 2nd century AD that continued to have admirers at least until the 5th. Unlike much of our poetry from this period, each translated poem seems to be complete, not fragmentary, and the poem's brevity precludes the puzzlement concerning structure that troubles some people working on longer poems. But after the more complex and somewhat laboured Hellenistic compositions, to which I earlier referred but had no time to illustrate, the directness, compactness, and freshness of Mesomedian poetry have a dynamism that I think fully entitles them to a place in the gallery of later Greek poetry and to not a few fans in our own generation. Thank you very much.